Hello. One of the defining events of our year since 2014 has been the Peter Chase Newman Civil Justice Lecture. The goal of the Newman Lecture is to elevate our civil justice system and to provide a window into the use of the law to pursue justice for individuals and for communities. And the pursuit of justice defines the career of Peter Chase Newman. A 1964 graduate of our college, he began his career as a criminal defense lawyer and then moved to service as a prosecutor in the Pima County Attorney's Office. In 1968, Peter moved to Reno, where he sustained an active practice, a civil plaintiff's practice, for many years and became an active participant and leader in the Reno community and in Nevada. In the early 1970s, he was one of the first Nevada lawyers to win a multi-million-dollar damage verdict for his client. And over the years, he represented victims in air crashes, defective consumer product cases, and insurance bad faith cases, among others. Like so many plaintiffs' lawyers, and of course, other lawyers too, Peter's interests extend to politics and public policy. His passion for the pursuit of justice includes a broad concern for the protection of civil rights, and he was especially pleased when our speaker today, Dr. Karen Korematsu, accepted the invitation to give this year's Newman Lecture. On a more personal level, Peter's a lifelong pilot of both planes with engines and those without. And on a very personal level, he made it possible for me to spend an afternoon soaring in a glider, which was one of my life's goals. Peter and his wife, Renate, are watching today from Reno. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Regents Professor Rebecca Tosi, the co-director of the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. Professor Tosi is an internationally recognized scholar in the area of federal Indian law and Indigenous peoples' human rights. She teaches, writes, and speaks widely on issues of sovereignty, self-determination, cultural pluralism, environmental policy, cultural rights, constitutional law, and critical race theory. Professor Tosi serves as a Supreme Court Justice for the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation and as an associate judge on the San Carlos Tribal Court of Appeals. Much of Professor Tosi's work has been in areas that intersect with the life's work of our speaker tonight: diversity, engagement, inclusion, social justice, and political and legal equity. Many thanks to my colleague, Professor Tosi, for being here tonight to introduce the 2021 Newman Lecture.
Thank you for that introduction, Dean Miller. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for this year's Newman Lecture, Dr. Karen Korematsu, who is the founder and executive director of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute and the daughter of the late civil rights icon, Fred Korematsu. Dr. Korematsu, I personally thank you for your visionary leadership in all of the areas that mean so much to the very diverse communities of this land. And thank you for being willing to join us tonight in this virtual space. We wish we could welcome you in person to our beautiful law school and our university community, which sits upon the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples, including the Tohono-O'odham Nation and the Pasquayaqui Nation. And we welcome you in that spirit because we understand the nature of our obligations in an intergenerational way to achieve justice for our families and our communities and our peoples. And as I read through your very extensive list of accomplishments, I was reminded of that instruction, that it really is an obligation that sits with us to make sure that justice is there for every future generation. And you do that so beautifully in your work. Your commitment to racial equity, social justice, and human rights is particularly important in this critical moment as we seek to protect our democracy and the values that are embodied within our Constitution. You serve your late father's legacy as a leader in this area. And you protect with that institute constitutional rights and civil liberties in many facets, including K through 12 education and public civic engagement. So you make that legacy of justice and the law come alive in the work that you do. Mr. Korematsu, of course, is a legendary civil rights hero, and all of us in this law community, as well as nationally, recognize this in many different ways. Mr. Korematsu was the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998 from President Bill Clinton, and he has an official day named after him in California with the legislature, which is the Fred Korematsu Day on January 30th. And that is a distinction because I believe that that is the first for an Asian American leader. The accolades are well deserved. And so in your remarks tonight, Dr. Korematsu, I know that you will discuss many of the aspects of that case, but I want to share in terms of our students and our legal community, the importance of the action that your father took at a very young age of 23 to resist what is probably one of the most horrendous and unjust actions of the US government in taking Japanese American citizens, tens of thousands of them, from their homes, divesting them of their constitutional liberties, and sending them to distant internment camps. One of those, of course, at Gila River here in Arizona. So there is a long history of injustice, and we respect your work and commitment of your father that that should never happen again. And indeed, that is one of the few instances in which the United States has made a gesture of reparative justice to a people. The legacy of that opinion from the Supreme Court that upheld that very unjust 1944 decision that upheld the military order keeps coming back to haunt us. And I appreciate so much the work that you have done with your institute to author those very powerful amicus briefs, the most recent one being in the Trump versus Hawaii case, where I think the words of the dissent in Korematsu versus United States, where the Justice Jackson said that principle of racial discrimination enshrined in an official order is very problematic as precedent because it will lie around like a loaded weapon ready to be used at the hands of any authority who would assert this utmost need. And of course, the 2018 decision upheld the travel ban that was directed toward predominantly Muslim nations. And your very powerful words in the op-ed that you wrote at that time, I really was moved by that because you wrote, blind deference to the executive branch, even in areas where the president does wield wide discretion, is incompatible with the protection of fundamental freedoms, and meaningful judicial review is an essential element of a healthy democracy. And that is the legacy that your father and you have created for our nation. The challenge for our nation is to realize that commitment to justice that exists. So Dr. Korematsu has a very long list of accomplishments. And in addition to this important legal work that she has done, and by the way, I will recognize that in 2015, she was inducted as the first non-lawyer member of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, which is a very fitting honor for somebody who lives that commitment to law as justice. Dr. Korematsu serves on the board of directors of Advancing Justice, AAJC, and the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association Foundation. She has been interviewed in so many TV and radio and podcast lectures, and I just love to hear her words, and as you will tonight, as well as authoring very powerful pieces in New York Times and Washington Post, among other prestigious publications. Dr. Korematsu is the recipient of so many awards and honors. And because our legal community recognizes the ACLU and the Chief Justice Earl Warren Civil Liberties Award, I know that that is one that you did receive, Dr. Korematsu, and commend you for that. Just last month, Dr. Korematsu received the Community Leadership Award from the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, which is a national nonprofit that is dedicated to promoting Asian Pacific American participation in the political process. Dr. Korematsu holds an honorary degree of human letters, a doctorate of human letters from the St. Michael's College in Burlington, Vermont. And that is just a partial list of many, many accomplishments. And it attests to your visionary leadership in all of the issues of justice that affect our nation so dramatically at this moment in time. Thank you, Dr. Korematsu, for giving this lecture tonight. We await your words and really appreciate your willingness to do this for us today. So welcome.
Thank you, Professor Sosi, for that kind and very generous introduction. And also thank you, Dean Miller, for the wonderful invitation to speak to the University of Arizona School of Law, and especially for the Newman Lecture Series. I was actually really looking forward to coming to Tucson. I haven't been there since 1980, and so I know a lot has changed there, but also to visit the students and to talk to them one-on-one. It's what I love about public speaking, and I know, eventually we'll be able to travel again, and because usually I travel about 80 or 90,000 miles a year, speaking all over the country. And as my age range of audience is 5 years old to judges. So I have a lot of territory to cover. But it's very exciting to be with you. I'm sorry I can't see all of you. That's the drawback from doing this this talk remotely. I'm in San Francisco, actually. My office is in the San Francisco Presidio, and it's ironic because it was the home of the Fourth Army during World War II. And General John DeWitt had issued over 100 exclusion orders, just kind of a stone's throw from my own office in the San Francisco Presidio, that took all the Japanese Americans from their homes up and down the West Coast. And 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 were American citizens. And that's important to remember. And 1/3 were under the age of 18. So when I first started speaking, even kindergartner teachers were surprised that they even took children, but and put them in prison camps. But obviously, it's what we're even seeing at the border now of separation of families was also a big issue at the time. And I was happy to learn that the law school emphasis is on civil justice. I feel that that's important for attorneys to emphasize in their education. History needs to be taught in the schools, and if it's a pathway actually to learning about effective civic participation. And when I first started working actually with our California Chief Justice, Tani Cantil Sukuyoe, I was learning, and she was telling me how many people come for jury selection that are not even familiar with the court system. That unfortunately in schools, I believe that civic is taught a bit too late. It should be taught at the beginning of the high school years, and even before that, because people need to have a solid understanding of our judicial system. I think that's where we really fall down. And in education needs to, in the public schools, needs to be broadened. And it's not too young for children to learn about how our system of government works. It doesn't have to be complicated, and sometimes we make these issues way too complicated. And it's important that children learn about our differences and about civics, and it's a good example of what they can do as they go on with their lives. My father and loved to speak to law students and to lawyers, because he knew that you would have the tools to uphold our Constitution and our civil liberties. And he had to make a decision when he was 23 years old, as the professor said, to decide whether he was going to disobey the military orders. Now, back in 1942, they called it military necessity. Now we call it national security. But my father, who was born in Oakland, California, and grew up like any other American kid, couldn't understand, why should he go to prison camp when he had done nothing wrong? And there was never any hearings, there were never any trials, even access to attorneys. It was all done under the guise of military necessity. And that's when President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942, that stripped away all due process of law. And we need to be reminded of that. Fortunately, when my father was arrested on May 30th, 1942, and it was about 30 days later, after his parents and brothers and community friends had been sent away to the Tanforan Detention Assembly Prison Center. So that was the first area they were sent to, and actually they were sent to a racetrack. The government found racetracks with horse stalls, and all they did was whitewash the horse stalls, and they still smelled like manure. There's dirt on the floor. There was a light bulb above. You had an army cot with a blanket, and that's the way people had to live for 3 or 4 months before they were sent off to one of the permanent 10 Japanese American concentration camps across this country, even as far as Arkansas. And we treat animals better than we treated the Japanese Americans. And so what in studying Supreme Court cases, or any case, that there's a humanity aspect to it. And we need to understand our history, so that when we make these decisions, these legal decisions, that we understand the impact that is going to make on human beings. And that's important, because it was like they were set aside. And so we know through our history, kind of the systematic racism that has even started from the time of our indigenous friends, and it's come up through the the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese Americans, and 9/11 to the Arab and Muslim and Amemsa communities. So this is the history that we've had along the way. And it's important to understand our history, because it does impact all of us as Americans. It's not just about one group, it's about all of us. And that's what we need to remember. And so my father, just couldn't believe that this was happening to himself and to all Americans, because he studied the Constitution in high school. So I even tell high school students, pay attention, because you need to know what your rights are as American citizens. And fortunately, it was Mr. Ernest Bessick of the ACLU, who was the executive director then of the Northern California affiliate, that visited my father in jail. And he was looking for a test case because he thought it was unconstitutional, and asked my father if he would be willing to fight his case, if need be, all the way to the Supreme Court. And my father thought for sure, by the time that his case would reach the Supreme Court would see it was unconstitutional. That's how much he believed in our judicial system and in this country. But you need to know that from after he was arrested, and he had his bail hearing, of course, and he was sent over to Tanforan, to that prison center there. He was not welcome with open arms. He was actually ostracized and vilified by his own Japanese American community. No one wanted anything to do with him because, well, actually they were afraid. And that's understandable. They thought if they associated with my father that some harm might come to them. You know, it was very scary for people. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. And even people that were of Issei, which were the first generation of the Japanese ancestry, they, you know, some of them thought they might get shot in one of these prison camps. That's how scary and uncertain it was, because they didn't know what was happening to them. And I think about my grandmother who came over from Japan and had high hopes for this country, and thought that it was an adventure to be here, but knew that there would be a better life, and married my grandfather. And to have her dignity stripped from her was not right. And we're better than that in this country. So my father went it alone. He was not deterred from keeping Mr. Bessick on the road to fighting for his rights as an American citizen. So it took, of course, several years through appeals to have his case reach the Supreme Court. And on December 18th, 1944, the decision came down from the Supreme Court. And also, you probably have read about Endo, Matsui Endo. That was a habeas corpus case. And actually, the government, when they knew that the Supreme Court was going to hear it, the day before, they announced that they were going to close all these Japanese American concentration camps. So of course, then her case became moot. And so it doesn't quite get the recognition that it deserves. But she also, people tried to get her to not fight the case, but she was also determined because she was a civil servant. She had done nothing wrong. She was an American citizen as well. So, as many of you know, in the Supreme Court decision, it was not unanimous. It was a 6-3 decision. And that's important because the 3 dissenting opinions are still relevant today. When I first started learning about all this, it was like, wow, these Supreme Court justices wrote these decisions that I thought were so meaningful. And I always encourage law students and anyone to read them because they are so meaningful. I just wanted to refer to Justice Frank Murphy in his dissenting opinion. He said, this exclusion of all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien from the Pacific Coast area on a plea of military necessity in the absence of martial law ought not to be approved. Such exclusion goes over the very brink of constitutional power and falls into the ugly abyss of racism. And that's a strong statement. And even Justice Stephen Breyer, who I've met a few times, has emphasized that ugly abyss of racism, and marveled at the fact that Justice Murphy came up with that statement. And Justice Owen Roberts called it unconstitutional. I dissent because I think the indisputable facts exhibit a clear violation of constitutional rights. Justice Jackson said, "Much is said of the danger of liberty from the Army program for deporting and detaining these citizens of Japanese extraction. But a judicial construction of the due process clause that will sustain this order is a far more subtle blow to liberty than the promulgation of the order itself. A military order, however unconstitutional, is not apt to last longer than the military emergency. Even during that period, a succeeding commander may revoke it all. But once a judicial opinion rationalizes such an order to show that it conforms to the Constitution, or rather rationalizes the Constitution to show that the Constitution sanctions such an order, the court, for all time, has validated the principle of racial discrimination in criminal procedure and of transplanting American citizens. The principle lies about like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need." And actually, after 9/11 in 2001, Attorney General Ashcroft cited my father's Supreme Court case as a possible reason to round up Arab and Muslim Americans and put them again in American concentration camps. So these are the types of decisions that still unfortunately ring true today. And certainly my father was so disappointed, and actually the word he'd used was disgusted, because he thought the Supreme Court certainly would see that this was unconstitutional. Now he went on with his life. And actually before the end of the war, the government knew that Japanese Americans were not dangerous. In fact, they never even found any evidence of any espionage or signaling from the West Coast to Japan. Even actually they had the reports from J. Edgar Hoover, of all people, that cited that there was never any espionage. And the Army report, the Ringel report, was also cited that. However, that information did not get to the Supreme Court. My father just carried on with his life, and as I was starting to say, towards the end of the war, you could go east if you could get a job, and there were sponsors, community sponsors, that would come in. And so my father did go east and ended up in Detroit, Michigan, where he married and met my mother, who was born actually in South Carolina. And at the time, because of the anti-racial marriage laws, they couldn't go to South Carolina or even come back to California, because those laws did not change until 1948. So this was obviously way before Loving versus Virginia, and you should know about that case as well. But my father believed in this country, and my parents came back to the Bay Area. My brother and I were born out here and grew up here, and attended schools. But he participated in all kinds of community organizations and Boy Scouts, and helped with my Girl Scouts, and was involved with church. And he lived by his moral principles of right and wrong. And I didn't even learn about my father's Supreme Court case until high school. And that was done through actually a report that my childhood friend had given about the Japanese American, what they called internment back in those days. And she was describing this time in history, and saying it was really a terrible thing, that people had been stripped away of their possessions. They could only carry with them in two hands what they could, that was it, and they had to leave their other possessions behind, hoping that a neighbor perhaps would look after their possessions, could sell maybe property probably only for 10 cents on the dollar, if that. But people didn't even think that the Japanese Americans were coming back to their homes, because they were gone for 3 years or more. And so the neighbors ended up even selling some of the possessions. But there were some good stories, some backstories about neighbors who, if you had farming land, there were other Caucasian neighbors that looked after the land and kept the money left over from the operations of those farms and gave the money back to the Japanese Americans when they were able to return. But it was a terrible time. And when people left these incarceration camps, they received $25 and a bus ticket, and that was it. And you had to start over from there. And it was a terrible time, and people just pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and worked very, very hard to raise their families and to prove that they were good Americans. Now, my father, until the time of when Professor Peter Irons came to visit him, and this is in 1982, and basically Peter, who was a legal historian, was writing a book about the World War II Supreme Court cases, had found the smoking gun. In other words, documents that showed that there was no military necessity for the Japanese and Japanese Americans to be forcibly removed from their home. And part of the education that I do, by the way, is to point out these euphemisms, because they were, back in those times, they were using the word evacuation. Well, I can tell you that 5 and 6 year olds know what evacuation means, and that it's to be removed for your own safety. And this clearly was not for their own safety. So they were forcibly, removed from their homes. And along with another researcher, Aiko Herzog Yoshinaga, who they shared the evidence that enabled my father's Supreme Court case to be reopened, along with Men Yasui and Gorin Hirabayashi. Now, those two cases dealt with really the curfew. And so the three cases were heard in 3 different courts. My father in San Francisco, Men Yasui's in Oregon, and Gorin Hirabayashi's in Washington. And up until that time, I did not know that my father never gave up hope that someday he would be able to reopen his Supreme Court case, but he didn't know how to do that. And Peter Irons, a credit to him, because he thought, well, no, he should not take the lead on this case. He knew that there were some Japanese American attorneys that at the time was talking about redress and reparations for the Japanese American community. And mind you, it was really the civil rights movement of the 1960s that the African Americans pursued that gave the encouragement to Japanese Americans to try for redress and reparations. And so Peter contacted Dale Minami, who became the lead counsel, and then created a team of attorneys. Now, I want to tell you that these young attorneys worked on this case pro bono. They worked on it day and on the weekends. And so I want to emphasize to all you young attorneys, and even to any other attorneys that are listening to this, that the importance of promoting pro bono work. It's so important. And if once you graduate from law school and you go into firms, ask, what's their policy for pro bono? And if they don't have one, maybe you can create one. There's always ways of supporting our judicial system and ways of giving back. And it's important. And, this pro bono team, I want to tell you, was created by friends knowing friends. So it's important, the relationships that you create in law school, because you never know what's going to happen in life. When you want to call upon your former law students and work on a project, or work on a legal case, or work on a cause that's important to you, and you know that they would be interested. But this pro bono team, who I was very suspicious in the very beginning, I have to tell you, because I thought, well, what's in it for them? You know, that they want to take on this case and then especially not be paid for it. But they certainly, you know, had justice in their heart and in their hearts. And it's important, you know, that you know, the teams that you create, that you're like-minded, even though you can agree to disagree and work out these issues, because that's how success is accomplished and these cases are able to happen. And I've always been appreciative, and actually it's very unusual as quote, you know, clients, to have such an extended family of attorneys who we all keep very close and work together even on other projects today. So this is a lifelong experience and challenge that we've taken on individually and together. And it's important that, and you keep that in mind, because we make change together. It's hard to do it by yourself, but we make change together. And right now, that's what we need. So by the time that uh, uh, Judge Marilyn Hall Patel heard my father's case, it was November 10th, 1983. And her decision is like she wrote it yesterday, because it's so meaningful. And also, you should know that that day in court in San Francisco, you know, was not only for my father, but was for all Japanese Americans, because my father also took a risk of reopening up his case the second time. He could have lost. And actually, he didn't have any support by his own Japanese American community, because they said, Fred, if you fight this, if you open up your case and you lose, then we're going to lose our chances for redress and reparations. But true to my father's form, he was going to go ahead, and he did so, you know, very quietly. My father was a soft-spoken, kind, generous person, and he treated everyone like he wanted to be treated. And he was a person of his convictions. His moral principles were ones that he lived by. And I think we all can take a lesson from that. And that's what he represents. That, if you want to make change, you can do so. But it takes determination. And, he didn't do this for just himself or the Japanese American community. He wanted to fight his case for all Americans, because he didn't want something like the Japanese American incarceration to happen again. And that's how strongly he felt. And that's my message to all of you, and why he also crisscrossed this country, speaking until 5 months before he passed away in 2005 at the age of 86. And we, he's certainly my inspiration and my hero. But the day that, it's very unusual, as you may know, for a judge to give an opinion from the bench. But Judge Patel knew that all these people came to her courts. In fact, they had to move from her regular court to the ceremonial court, and even to put screens up in the side court, because there were so many different people that had come. But she said, and I quote, Korematsu remains on the pages of our legal and political history. As a legal precedent, it is now recognized as having very limited application. As historical precedent, it stands as a constant caution that in times of war or declared military necessity, our institutions must be vigilant in protecting constitutional guarantees. It stands as a caution that in times of distress, the shield of military necessity and national security must not be used to protect governmental actions from close scrutiny and accountability. It stands as a caution that in times of international hostility and antagonisms, our institutions, legislative, executive, and judicial, must be prepared to exercise their authority to protect all citizens from the petty fears and prejudices that are so easily aroused. And that hangs true today. I want that to sink in because it's so important to remember those words. We are a time in our country when we have seen the anti-Asian violence. That truly breaks my heart. My father would be very, very upset. And it's going to take all of our voices to speak up against it. Not just Asian American voices, but all voices. And as we've seen with Black Lives Matter and the movement that was started last year, we saw people on the streets that came from all ethnicities, the diversity, the inclusion, to take a stand against violence. We need that now again. But now we need to take the opportunity to take action. We need to take the action to stop the systemic racism and the violence. So we all need to participate because this is about our livelihoods. This is about humanity, and we all need to care about humanity and social justice. When I've been asked along the way to also support amicus briefs, and when I want to be mindful that when I do, this is in the spirit of my father's legacy, of what he would do. The decisions that I make as I think that he would have made. And certainly as he's my hero and my inspiration. And he gave me the charge before the end of his life to carry on with education. And that's why we started off with focusing on K through 12 education, but now it's even extended to community colleges and also the general public, because the reminders of our civic participation, as I said, is so important. And we need to encourage everyone to do what they can. And when you start off, in your careers, of course, you're not going to have a lot of time. And then you have families and you may not have a lot of time. But maybe along the way, you might be able to do an hour here, or 10 years down the road, several hours in trying to make a difference, whether it's helping people to register to vote, or helping in the schools where your children are, with their education, in supporting the parent teacher student associations, or whatever organizations that align with what your interests are, but are for social justice. I think that's, if we kept all of that in mind, because that's what my Father's Day represents. So in 2010, Governor Schwarzenegger actually signed the legislative bill that established Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution. And the importance is to focus on our civil liberties and the Constitution, that it's up to all of us to keep fighting for our civil liberties and the Constitution and our democracy. because obviously we've seen that our democracy is at risk. It's not something to be taken for granted. And it's going to take all of us to make that change. Now, I'm a big believer that we can agree to disagree, and certainly we all have our differences, but we can find that common ground first, what we believe in. We all love this country, and we want our families to do well, and we want to do well. But we need to also be mindful of teaching about our differences. And so what the focus now of the Korematsu Institute is, we've been working in ethnic studies. We, for the state of California, I've been working with our California superintendent, and fortunately the California Board of Education just approved the ethnic studies model curriculum that actually will be have a legislative bill in California to have it as a 1 semester requirement for high school students to have 1 semester of ethnic studies. You could have blown me away when I first started working on this a couple of years ago, because for California, you would have thought that already would be in place, but it's not. And the importance of ethnic studies is to learn about our differences, and our different ethnicities, because prejudice is ignorance, and the only way to fight that is through education. Education is our most powerful tool that we must use to help this generation and future generations. We need to show respect. I never thought I would get to this age in life when I would need to be teaching about respect, and to teach about our moral principles, that we need to decide along the way what is right and what is wrong. Are you going to go down, this path or that path? What are you going to do? What are some of the challenges that are going to confront you when you have to make those decisions of right and wrong, of being honest or being dishonest? And these are principles, especially in law. I mean, obviously, with the rule of law is what we're all working towards, right? But underneath the rule of law is humanity. And we must remember that. And because I think that's something that we have also lost along the way, that we need to show respect. We need to show kindness to each other, to our neighbors. It's interesting that I was a speaker at the National Judicial College in Reno, and I was learning that the judges that are Superior Court judges, not necessarily federal judges, but all these other judges, come to really learn how to conduct their courts. You've already got a degree, you know about the law. That's not why you're there. But it's, the judges that I've been speaking to in the conferences I've been speaking to, it's about how we conduct ourselves and the respect that we have, and also to be aware of unconscious bias, because that is an issue that we need to recognize, that we all are have that from time to time, and as well as paying attention to explicit bias. So these types of underlining issues that to me are humanitarian, that but they do affect the law, because it's the way that we conduct ourselves, or how we take the laws and then want to try to take the law and make it for ourselves in a way that may not be positive. It's kind of like bending it, and that's not the road that you ever want to go down. So it's important to to be mindful of the implicit bias that we see, but the unconscious bias that we may all have, and to recognize it and be able to talk about it. we now are at a stage here where we need to be purposeful, to acknowledge the truth and to talk about these issues of, the anti-Asian violence, the negative rhetoric, the discrimination, and the racism that is still prevalent. And so, the discussion, of course, is whether the murders in Atlanta was at racism. Well, I know it's a very fine line, and but we all need to be conscious of it, because that's the perception from the public that they take away. And we need to be able to talk about these issues purposefully. So fortunately, and the exciting news is that in the Senate, in a committee, now we have Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution Day bill being considered for the state of Arizona. Very exciting. And as it's been through the House, and I believe that if I'm correct, I'll get emails if I'm not, that it's passed through the House, the legislative bill, and now is in the Senate. And this would be a day on January 30th, which is my father's birthday, that would be honored by and recognized by the governor, and also to have the superintendent of instruction encourage teachers and students to learn about my father's fight for justice and how it relates to our issues today, especially of immigration and the racism that we are experiencing, and social justice that we all are working towards. So it won't be a holiday. We have to have a lot of states under our belt in order to make that happen. But we hope that someday that will, because Asian Americans haven't had a face. African Americans have Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and Cesar Chavez, but where's the Asian American that's representing our community and all those other communities that have been marginalized? Because my father was one of the first to speak up after 9/11. When Ashcroft was going to was cited my father's Supreme Court case as a reason to round up Arab and Muslim Americans, and he said no. He even spoke up during the Gulf War when Arab Americans were being racist remarks against them. So this was the type of issues that my father believed in. It was for everyone and worked across communities. Our intersectionality now is important, and we need to emphasize that. So I hope to also be back in Arizona sooner rather than later, because the Korematsu Institute actually has a National Park Service Japanese American confinement site grant, where we're going to be working with educators in Arizona to develop curriculum and with curriculum writers about Gila River, which was one of the 10, as the professor pointed out, 10 Japanese American incarceration camps, and also Poston, the Colorado River tribe site was where other Japanese Americans were incarcerated, and to show the intersectionality of our two different communities, and also to recognize that actually when I visited Gila River several years ago through NAPABA, when we had a convention in Scottsdale, we went there and I talked with the tribal leader, and I said, did the government actually ask the Gila River tribe for permission to build this incarceration camp on your land? And he said, well, yes, they asked. And I said, but what was your answer? Well, we said no, and the government did it anyway. So this was so upsetting to me, to even know that, and to show the disrespect of that tribal nation And so these are the important stories that need to be told, and to recognize that we are more alike than not. And we all need to respect each other's differences and to appreciate each other's cultures, because we all add something to being Americans. And I encourage you all to, to support this legislative bill, and we'll see. We hope to have a celebration, and even your Governor Ducey several years signed a proclamation. So we've had that from across this country, from different governors and legislators. So we're working towards that effort. But now I want everyone to use their voices to speak up. And as my father, said, stand up for what is right and don't be afraid to speak up. Thank you.
Dr. Korematsu, thank you for that incredibly powerful set of stories and narratives. I did not know that story about the experience of Gila River, and that is new knowledge that I should have, that we should all have. We appreciate you so much, and I cannot tell you how amazing those stories were. And you are an incredible speaker and storyteller, but your knowledge is just, so I think I probably need to process a lot of things, but I have the honor of being available to facilitate a few audience questions if you have time and energy. Do you have time?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think I ran over. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, you are so good. So we have some fascinating questions that have come in. So I'm going to jump off of here and turn on my Q&A chat. So the first question, I'm going to take a little bit of liberty with this one. The question is actually, when did you realize that your father's experience would sort of inform your personal life's work? And I think that is a beautiful question. And I was reminded of that when you described your dad. It was so beautiful. It made me teary when you described his personality and that incredible sacrifice that he made. He didn't go with what people told him he should do. He went with what his moral leadership, his courage told him he must do. And you are so much aligned with that. So could you just tell us a little bit, just in your story, you were so respectful about keeping with the law and the case, and it was all fascinating, but we want to know about you.
Oh.
We want to know about your life and how this path opened up.
Well, I didn't know what I was going to do when my father gave me this charge to carry on with education, because I'm not an attorney, and I didn't really feel very comfortable talking about his legal case or the aspects of the legality of it all. But I mean, now, of course, Dale Manami, who was the lead counsel of my father's Coram Nobis team, and of course, Coram Nobis, I failed to say, means an error has been made before us, an error has been made before the court. So it's a little unknown writ that even Judge Patel thought, gee, she hadn't even heard that since law school. But it was, my identification with being an Asian American didn't happen until about the time of my father's case being reopened in 1983 or 82, 83. It's the first time that we had been exposed to any Asian American organizations. And so little by little, I became more involved in volunteering some, of my time, and, wanted to do something, and, eventually, but I didn't know how. And finally, we did, through another nonprofit legal organization, create a scholarship fund for a graduating law student to work at the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. And then eventually it evolved to, in 2009, trying to create an organization that was about youth leadership. But because the legislative bill was created to establish Fred Korematsu Day, then of course the focus became more education. And it's, it's happened gradually, right? Because I was not even thinking I'd ever be speaking. I mean, if you told me, back in 2009, even, that I would be doing all the public speaking that I'm doing now, I would have said, no way, not me. But it's happened over time. And of course, when I have to give also a shout out to the Arizona Asian American Bar Association, because they have had, in fact, I think that's where I met the dean at an event where they hosted me as a keynote speaker. And, and as I've crisscrossed this country, it's students that will say to me, gee, your father was my inspiration and the reason I went to law school. Those kinds of comments that I even actually would be standing with my father when he was living, and lawyers would come up to my father and tell him the same thing, that he was the reason that they went to law school, for his story and his fight for justice. So it's gradual. It just doesn't happen overnight, and it's the support that I've received and my father's inspiration to others that I see as so important. I feel I have the name, and I feel the responsibility to making sure that the inspiration that he started is carried on, through this generation and future generations.
Absolutely. What a beautiful account of that. So I'm going to again take a liberty in kind of compressing several of the questions. So several of the questions come from folks who are concerned about reactions to terminology. So if we designate something as a concentration camp rather than an internment camp, if we talk about racial hate rather than military necessity, if we talk about sort of the role of that decision as official racism, we are making a strong statement about the quality of justice or injustice and its alignment with the Constitution. Do you get pushback when you use those terms? People want a more gentle explanation, contextualized in history, and yet we see this racial violence happening today. So how do you navigate that terminology?
Well, thank you for that question, because when I first started speaking, that was the pushback that I received. When I started referring to the internment camps as concentration camps, I even have a childhood friend, very close childhood friend, that said, Karen, you can't use concentration camp. That's only for the Jewish camps and the Holocaust. And I said, well, President Roosevelt actually referred to the Japanese American internment camps as concentration camps. Even in the Supreme Court decisions of 44, the justices referred, some of the justices referred to the camps as concentration camps. So they're the ones that actually use the term. And, the difference is, I mean, you have to look at the definition. Now, for the Holocaust, I really call those death camps because most of them were death camps, right? Mm-hmm. But this shows the severity. This wasn't, and it's interesting because when I was growing up, until I heard about my father's Supreme Court case, I learned about it in high school, I would hear aunts and uncles say, oh, I just saw somebody from camp last week, or gee, this is kind of food we had in camp. And I thought, well, it must be like church camp, because what does camp mean? It means fun, right? So these euphemisms are important to discuss and point out. That's why I was talking about, I don't like the word evacuation. That's not accurate description. And back in especially in 1942, the government was trying to soft pedal the impact of the incarceration. And so they would come up with these euphemisms that, would kind of, it was like, oh, well, this isn't that bad. Well, yes, it was. And I think now we need to be respectful, mind you, but we need also to be purposeful and direct about describing what's happening. So violence is violence, racism is racism, and we cannot hide behind it anymore. And I think it's because it's always like, well, it happened to them, it's not happening to us. Well, this is now about all of us, and I can't emphasize that any more than that. And I think it's also, you are going to get pushback, and that's what I'm saying is you can agree to disagree, but to know the facts and to understand them before you start, maybe speaking about maybe principles that you don't necessarily, or words maybe you're not clearly sure about, then do the research first, so that when you can cite me, Karen Korematsu said this, that's fine, because I get the pushback all the time. But
a lot of us are going to be citing you, Dr.
It's important that we confront these situations. And even, I didn't really get to talk about really much about I was running out of time, Trump versus Hawaii. This is the problem. I could keep on going here. And of course, I know you, Professor, mentioned that, and it actually, just so people are aware, especially the legal community, the Justice Chief Roberts, what his statement was Korematsu was overruled in the court of history, right? So it was dicta for all of you legal scholars out there. It was dicta, because it was Justice Sotomayor who wrote this scathing dissent, and read that dissent, because she was the one, she cited me in her amicus brief, and said that it was, Korematsu should be overruled, but in the manner in which it was done, to me, I will say, was not honorable. Mm-hmm. And after I even wrote that op-ed and had discussions with even constitutional scholars, it's it is a question. Could they cite my father's case as being overruled or precedent? And that's debatable.
Yes.
But this is what happens in law, and it's okay to have these debates, because even the decision of 1944 was, they said this is not about racism. Well, clearly it was about racism, and we need to identify these issues if we're going to make any change, because we can't hide or be afraid of not speaking truth to power. And it's important that we all take that on as our responsibility, and not be afraid of the pushback, because that's just life.
Thank you. That is totally encouraging. There is a question from our students, and I love our students, and I can't wait for you to meet them in person one day, but you're meeting them virtually, and they are writing in very excited, very uplifted. I'm going to synthesize a few of these student comments, because they say, how did your dad stay positive in the face of that horrendous set of experiences, totally dehumanizing, very, very oppressive? He stayed positive. He fought for justice his whole life. He was finally vindicated, and they want to read the opinion that you cited in his by Judge Patel. So people are very interested in reading that. Thank you so much for directing us that way. And then other students are writing in that they've been feeling just completely depressed and bombarded ever since the George Floyd murder and all of these racial hate crimes and everything that happened with the politics of the election. And they're just feeling like completely depressed, and they want to know what they can do or what you advise young students to do, because they feel like they don't get taken seriously, but they want to do something. So what is your message to our students?
You should know that my father was the type of person that he just didn't give up hope. And he I think for students, especially, well, it's a long time since I was a student, but to really take some time in reflection and thinking about their purpose, your purpose, as a student, as a human being, as what you're going to do in the legal world. I mean, even a lot of students that graduate from law school go on to other fields, but they always have that wonderful, I think going to law school, I'm such a big cheerleader, that it gives you that kind of foundation of writing and critical thinking, but also being, introspective as well. And but for my father, it just wasn't complicated. And I think sometimes we make life too complicated. He just believed in this country. He believed in what was right and wrong. And that's how he lived his life. And that's what inspires me. Now, as far as what students can do, is sometimes it's difficult to do things by yourself. So you want to, if you're in an organization, there's probably different organizations on campus that you can be a part of. So let's say you've got a group that you're in, or look for a group that fits your purpose, your beliefs that you want to be aligned with. I mean, that's what I mean by knowing yourself. You have to know yourself. You have to know your own story in order to to appreciate other people's stories, right? And also to think about, when you start doing things for others, then really it comes back to you, because that's the way my father, lived his life. He was always doing for others. He was at International Lions Club and doing things at church or whatever, and he was always doing other things for others. And then that comes back to you. And that's something to keep in mind. But organizations now can post something. I mean, social media. I mean, let's use social media in a positive manner and a positive message. There is so much hate out there. So you want to denounce the hate. You want to support others. Work, across communities. If it's an Asian American group, maybe you can work with a Latino group, indigenous group, those types of different, groups that you all want the same thing, but your cultures are different, but that's okay. You're going to share that and make those kinds of statements where you denounce this anti-Asian violence. You denounce the anti-Asian rhetoric, and also the violence against African Americans, and that you support the Black Lives Matter movement, because that's, this is the movement. That movement is really given way to inspire. You saw people in the streets that were, came from all, it's diversified, all different ethnicities in the marches. Now, my father did say, protest, but without violence. So, we don't encourage violence, because that was what my father was against. But protest, and as my dear departed friend Congressman John Lewis said, march. It's important that we do this, that we march together, for these causes. And whether it's for diversity in our workplaces, or for students, what are policies that you would like to see changed, that you've been thinking about, but you've been kind of alone on. Find that other person or partner. that's what I'm saying is those relationships that you have now, especially in law school, are so important, and the organizations that you are affiliated with as well, because that gives you the power. You know, there's kind of that safety in numbers, so to speak. But also don't be afraid to speak up. I mean, if Fred Korematsu was one person that made a difference in the face of adversity, so can you. It's, you just have to believe and have that conviction, and it may take practice. We're all kinds of, this didn't happen overnight for me either. So there's ways of working together so that we can make this change, whether it's in our laws, gun control laws, or which I think, I mean, that's another subject. But we definitely need to make changes. There's too many. We need to close those loopholes, and find those common causes that are, write letters. You can always write letters to your legislators, because they have to pay attention to their constituents and make phone calls. So if you want to support Fred Korematsu Day, call your local legislator, and also talk about it in the schools, because that's how we make you have to think about the positive ways you can make impact, and in the face of all this negative, and it is overwhelming, because it's like, oh my gosh, it's like somebody just sucked me in the stomach. Are you kidding me? It's, we just keep ramping up, and make people accountable for their words. Words matter, folks. Words matter. So how we use our words is important, and we need to be sure that words are used with respectful purpose and for meaningful purpose, and make those people accountable, and push back on those people that use words that are against the grain, are against social justice.
Thank you so much, Dr. Korematsu. You have given us much to think about, and you've given us a positive, meaningful charge for our future. We are so grateful that you took the time tonight to be with us. I cannot thank you enough. On behalf of the University of Arizona and our law school, I thank you for your beautiful work. We look forward to working with you, and we will certainly be writing those letters to our Arizona legislature. Thank you. Thanks to the audience for joining us. We are over time, but we have just really, really beautiful lecture tonight. Thank you. And good night.
Bye.